I've done mistakenly put this on. So good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Jennifer Okeke, and I'm privileged to be the chairperson of the National Women's Council. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Irish Architectural Archive in Marion Square. I want to extend a warm greeting to those joining us both in person and online. I would like to sincerely thank the Irish Architectural Archive for graciously hosting this very important event. Today marks the launch of an important report titled Women Who Lead, Amplifying and Accelerating Women's Interests, a significant contribution to the understanding of women's substantive representation and policy influence within the Oireachtas. This report, researched and authored by Professor Pauline Cullen, examines the tangible policy impacts of women leaders through two illuminating case studies: the advancement of reproductive rights and the repeal of the AIDS, and the adoption of the Istanbul Convention and the establishment of CUAN, the state agency dedicated to addressing domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. On behalf of NWC, I would like to extend our deep appreciation to the European Women's Lobby for funding this vital research. We are especially pleased to have Ms. Maya Donova, Program Coordinator at the EWL, with us here today. We are grateful to Maya and her team for their steadfast partnership and their ongoing work in advancing gender equality across Europe. Maya will shortly share insights into EWL's initiatives and the broader European context for women's leadership and representation. We are also honored to have Professor Pauline with us this morning. She will present the findings of her research. Following the presentation, we will engage with a distinguished panel of experts chaired by the journalist and broadcaster Flo McCarthy. The panel will include Alva Smith, Ellen O'Malley Dunlop, Jane O'Sullivan, and Brian Sheehan. This discussion promised to deepen our understanding of how women's political leadership translates into meaningful social change and progressive policy outcomes. Established in 1973, the National Women's Council is the leading representative organization advocating for women's rights, gender equality across the Isle of Ireland. As a membership-based feminist organization, NWC is deeply rooted in its collective network, working in close partnership with nearly 200 membership groups and expanding community of individual supporters. Together, we pursue a shared vision, the full realization of women's rights and equality in all aspects of the Irish society. One of the Council's core objectives is to ensure that women's voices are represented in all decision-making arenas that influences their lives, from local community to national institutions. Achieving gender equality and fostering sustainable, inclusive democracies demand the active participation of feminist women in decision-making spaces across sectors of society. This includes not only representation in the Oireachtas and government structure, but also the strengthening of feminist leadership within communities, civil societies, and grassroots movements. True equality requires that women are not only present, but are empowered to shape, influence political, social, and economic agendas as well. Despite significant progress over the past decade, structural barriers continue to impede women's full participation in political and public life. The well-documented 5 C's, cash, confidence, culture, candidate selection, and care, remains persistent challenges for women seeking political office. These barriers highlight enduring inequalities across in access to resources, societal expectation, and institutional practices. More recently, a 6th C has been identified by the Women for Election: cyber abuse. an increasingly prevalent and concerning obstacle for women in public life, which poses serious risk to both participation and personal safety. The outcome of the recent local election further illustrates the systemic barriers, particularly challenges for incumbency, which continues to disadvantage first-time female candidates seeking to enter political offices. Women equal participation in political and public life remains unevenly distributed across Irish society. Migrant women, traveler and Roma women, working class women, disabled women, lone parents, women of color, and women in rural areas continue to encounter systemic barriers that restrict their full engagement in decision-making processes. Addressing these inequalities remains a sustained commitment to making political institutions more accessible, inclusive, and supportive, particularly for women with caring responsibilities. Many women councillors describe managing triple shifts, the simultaneous demand of paid employment, caregiving, and political office, which underscores the urgent need for structural reform that facilitates meaningful participation. The escalation of online abuse and offline violence further exacerbates the challenges faced by women in leadership. Such hostilities serve not only as a deterrent for women's entry into public life, but also as a mechanism for silencing diverse voices once present. These threats are particularly acute for women from marginalized backgrounds, who experience intersecting forms of discrimination that compounds gender-based barriers. The current political and social environment in which women's leadership operates has undergone a radical transformation. The backlash against women's rights and the erosion of commitment to equality and anti-discrimination and the resurgence of far-right ideologies have collectively created a hostile context for gender justice and democratic participation. These developments threaten to undermine decades of progress in advancing women's rights and gender equality. Strategic investment in women's leadership across all sectors of the society is imperative. Women remain at the forefront of efforts to resist the rise of the far right, extremism, racism, misogyny, making their empowerment and protection a democratic necessity rather than a moral aspiration. To confront these complex challenges, both feminist and intersectional leadership is essential. Such leadership recognizes the ways in which multiple forms of oppression, including gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, intersects to shape women's lived experience and opportunities to participation. Ensuring that diverse voices are both heard and valued in public decision processes is critical to creating inclusive, equitable, and representative governance. Only through such an intersectional approach can policies and institutions reflect the realities of women's lives, particularly those marginalized, and contribute meaningfully to a more just and equal society. The report launched today underscores the tangible policy impacts that women leaders can achieve, illustrating how they engage in collaborative alliance building and the strategic use of diverse approach to drive social and political change. These strategies often differ significantly from those traditionally employed by men, reflecting distinct form of feminist and collective leadership that prioritizes inclusive dialogue and shared power. It is my pleasure now to welcome Ms. Maya Donovan, Project Coordinator at the European Women's Lobby, who will speak briefly about the remarkable work undertaken by the organization in advancing gender equality across Europe. You're welcome, Maya.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you and to share and learn, actually, because I'm here more to listen than to talk, so I'll be very brief. My name is Maya. I represent the European Women's Lobby. I'm Bulgarian, and I've been working in the international field for around 15 years in different capacities, mainly around human rights and inclusion, and in the last 5 years, focusing on women's rights. So for me, I would maybe like to start just for a few sentences. If you don't know what the lobby is, we are the largest women's rights organization, representing over 2,000 organizations from all across Europe. So this is a very bold statement. And I remember the first time I heard it, because it also follows with and we represent all women in their diversity, which is even bolder statement than the first one. And obviously, we cannot do this in our small secretariat in Brussels. We do this through our work with people like Jennifer, with people like you, who represent different parts of how women are, and what women want. So thank you very much for working, because this is how we actually can work as well with the European Commission and with the European Parliament, based on your work, your reports, your feedback, the contact that you have with the grassroots organizations, because otherwise our work will very quickly become isolated and meaningless. So I take a lot of pride by representing the lobby, because I actually come from a grassroots organization myself, and I know that if this work is not transformed into policymaking on European level in Brussels, it actually gets lost. So I think the way to do this is through reports, is through meetings, is through conversations, where we actually try to see where Europe is heading towards. We already heard in the beginning part of the concerns shared, that there is this right-wing rise, conservative trends rise in different corners of Europe, and this is also part of our work. So in short, maybe I would like to point out two things which are important this year and the following year, the new European Union budget. Because if we speak about women's rights and then political priorities, many times we hear policymakers say, well, women are a priority, gender equality is a priority. But if we don't see that reflected in the budget, that's that's not really, ideally, that means that we're not really a priority. So what the lobby is doing in the past few months, after the announcement of the new European Union budget, the new so-called MFF, we're really trying to push for the EU to remember that they have committed to gender budgeting as a horizontal priority, and that this is not an extra, that it's not something that we can still argue about. And it actually means that even in new initiatives, for example, like the Rearm EU, which is about security and defense, there also has to be a gender lens, that there also has to be the reminder that women has to be in the focus of public spending, because otherwise we're actually left out. So the MFF is one of the things that we're really keeping a close eye to and trying to influence it, while working with the Commission and the Parliament and with other umbrellas based in Brussels. And the other thing, I already mentioned it this morning to the colleagues who are here early, that so this morning was a historic vote on the abortion rights for women, just an hour ago in the FEM committee, and it actually passed. Of course, it's too early to celebrate, because it still has some steps to left until it's formalized. But I was just thinking how strange it is to speak about women representation and policymaking and growth and innovation and everything else, and in the same time to still have to defend our body autonomy in the same day. And this is, to me, it's a sign that, yes, we need to speak about representation, but we cannot continue to have to defend our right to have a safe abortion, our right to reproductive health, our right to exist in a way that we find good. So by putting this, I don't want to confuse you and ask you too many questions in this small intervention that I have, but rather to put it in perspective. Europe has so many achievements in the last century, in the last decade, when it comes to women's rights. But then we really have to safeguard those, because there are so many proofs from my home country, Bulgaria, to the Baltic states trying to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, from different right-wing leaders who are glamorizing threadwife trends. Like, all of those things are very, they're showing us a trend, and we cannot ignore this trend. We have to fight this trend by political measures, by budget measures, by advocacy, by campaigns, and everything that everything that you represent, I think is the ultimate response to this. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm really excited to hear about the report. We have funded 10 projects in all across Europe. They're all different. So some of them are about gender-based violence. Some of them are about women in policymaking. So I'm sure this one is one of the best. Let's put it like this. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. And it's a real privilege to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to share this research report today. And hello to everybody online. I want to start by underlining what this is not about. Okay? It's not about a kind of a reductive or sentimental idea about women as leaders. It's also not about discounting the important role of male allies. And it is not about the flattening of complex social justice goals into just a question of representation. What this is an account of women leaders who display conduct that includes communication, connection and dialogue with allies and potential allies that often requires the practice of what others have called political courage, seen as a vital element of democratic participation. And political courage is a commitment to resolution and persistence in the face of risk, uncertainty, resistance, and fear. And it values the relationship between parliamentary politics and the wider public realm that includes feminist and pro-equality civil society. So what do we know about women leaders? Well, we know that women politicians are heterogeneous, but research finds that women legislators are often more likely to support and pursue women-friendly policies. They build consensus around shared interests, they compromise in legislation, and they represent women's interests through the bills they sponsor and co-sponsor, and through symbolic acts, such as speeches that they give in Parliament and their focus on women and girls. The presence of women leaders is also shown to reduce gender gaps in voting, encouraging women to vote. And the physical presence and the ways in which women leaders conduct themselves in politics can also have an effect on their male colleagues. Yet while women leaders tend to diversify policy agendas, increase their party's emphasis on social justice issues and initiate more family-friendly and feminist policies, scholars are still cautious to make links between women's presence and gender policies, indicating a contingent rather than a causal link, as there are many conditions that may need to be in place for women to act on women's interests. So what I am going to share with you this morning is really an overview of research on women's influence on policy agendas and some evidence in the Irish case for the relationship between women's political presence as leaders and policies that advance gender equality. The report presented here concludes that despite the overrepresentation of men in politics in Ireland, women leaders in politics, civil society, and the civil service have allied to advance gender equality goals. So research does tell us that there is a link between women leaders and gender responsive policy, but it can be seen best when there is a critical mass of women, when their numbers pass a threshold. Then we can expect perhaps institutions to change. However, others indicate that more women in politics can also dampen men's interest in advancing gender equality because they assume that women politicians will do it. Other elements include how backlash, that we've heard about already this morning, can also hamper women's politicians' efforts. Other factors, such as whether women politicians have a feminist perspective, the ideology of the party they belong to, and the nature of their relations with feminist civil society, and the existence of state gender equality machinery have all been indicated as important beyond the actual numbers of women leaders in effectively representing women's interests. In sum, it is most likely that all of these elements interacting together, and especially the alliances that women establish among themselves from the different spaces they occupy, is in fact decisive in promoting gender equality. What we do know about substantive representation for women is then that it's often an outcome of the collective work that happens in political institutions, especially when women leaders work together inside and outside of parliaments. Women leaders also work in institutions that are gendered and raced and classed, and to deliver responsive policy making, they must have access to power. Measures of substantive representation of women should also include not just what women leaders say and do, but the processes that they use to consult and incorporate women's views and organisations into policy making. In other words, how women leaders behave in politics matters, in the sense of who they engage with outside of parliaments. This includes, in the Irish case, the role of feminist and allied civil society that have introduced new frameworks, mobilised their members in innovative campaigns, and substantive policy submissions to the political system. It is also very important that we're clear about what we mean by women's interests. And scholars have employed that concept to acknowledge women's diversity by defining them as those issues that emerge from the gender division of labour and the hierarchies of status and influence that disadvantage women relative to men. But the escalation of contests around gender, particularly those associated with far-right forces, complicates how parliaments advance women's interests, as they can be instrumentalised by bad faith actors. So in this sense, we have to be very careful that we're defining the substantive representation of women in the most intersectional way, reflecting the multiple structures positioning those that are represented and their interests. Now, to talk about the report and the approach taken a little, given the scope of the report, the approach taken is indicative rather than comprehensive, but it's aiming to identify two policy areas where there is evidence of delivery on women's interests: repeal of the Eighth Amendment and ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and the establishment of the state agency Quotas with functions for combating DSGBV. And these cases are chosen because they give us an indication of how women leaders set agendas, frame narratives, collaborate and network to deliver substantive representation for women. Drilling down into two specific examples of political deliberation and policy making on gender justice enables a reflection then on how women's leadership in terms of access and influence intersected to amplify and accelerate and actualize policy that delivers for women. In this account, we don't follow specific women leaders, but identify the ecosystem that's required and the conditions that seem important for what we refer to as the constitutive representation of women in their diversity. This includes the presence of women leaders inside and outside of parliaments, and in other words, their actual embodied presence, their access to and position within systems and processes where deliberation and debate and influence can be exercised. This incorporates identifying the established hallmarks of how women lead: their use of feminist knowledge, experiential evidence, extra-parliamentary testimony, and particularly legal expertise, and their use of coalitions and parliamentary procedures. In the first case, 17 debates of the Joint Committee on the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution were assessed thematically, as well as ancillary commentary and analysis. And in the second case, a process tracing approach was used to map the key developments in the ratification of the Convention and the establishment of Quotas. Analysis of joint committee debates was chosen in a very particular way because it offers an advantage of capturing inputs from the Dáil and the Seanad and the inclusion of expert and witness testimony. Now, the measures of substantive representation are many. In a very simple way, some of the questions posed to the work related to: what did women do? Who did they consult? How did they talk about women? How responsive and inclusive was policy as a result? Now, in the first case, I do not particularly suggest a singular event or a set of people delivered repeal, but the work of this committee reflects one element of a complex tapestry of activist, legal, societal, and parliamentary engagements that make up the context for abortion law reform in Ireland. And that context included the long-standing existence of feminist activists and the establishment of new campaign groups alongside challenges to the existing law. This special committee of TDs and senators were tasked with considering the Citizen Assembly's report and reporting conclusions and recommendations to the Dáil and the Seanad within 3 months of their first public meeting. The 22-person committee included 13 women and the female chair, which provided a critical mass of women decision makers. This was significant given how women are a minority in parties, and this context gave them an anchor to reframe debates, collaborate, and network. A female senator was appointed to the committee as a chairperson. This is significant in allowing her to access positional but some active power. That's very important in contexts where women leaders face resistance. And this was a particular dynamic of the committee. The presence of women leaders in a critical mass and their conduct and tone offered tangible, embodied support and protection to the chair in particular. Their representational work demanded that deliberation be driven by facts and precision, that illustrated a deep engagement with the technical dimensions of the Citizen Assembly's report. And in some ways, committee members acted as a cordon sanitaire for both the chair, other women members, and expert witnesses to insulate the process from misdirection and delegitimization. Women leaders then used procedural rules and what Fiona de Landres and Mairead Enright and others have called feminist law work to enact and embody the credibility and democratic legitimacy of that committee. Now, a key measure of substantive representation for women is how women leaders talk about women's interests. And this case exemplified this in that women leaders from extra-parliamentary contexts provided testimony to the committee that deepened and exalted the quality of discourse and debate. And while intersectional dimensions of reproductive justice were under-examined in most parliamentary contexts, including this committee, female members did challenge pro-natalist ideas and unfounded and emotive claims around abortion care. Indeed, while the outcome of the committee fell short of some of the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, it was more ambitious than the proposal that emanated from the Cabinet, and it indicates the power of women's leadership to advance core elements of gender justice. Women's leadership demonstrated then responsiveness and interest articulation, creating opportunities for male allyship, safeguarding core elements of the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, and highlighting the lack of an evidential basis for minority views. The case exemplifies how long-fought civil society campaigns were amplified and translated into political capital by a critical mass of women parliamentarians. The second case deals with the ratification of the Istanbul Convention and the establishment of Quotas. Now, Ireland signed up, to the Istanbul Convention in 2015. The path towards ratification took almost 5 years. And subsequent associated policy developments, including the establishment of Quotas, represent a case where evidence exists on all 4 dimensions of substantive representation. Istanbul Convention ratification processes have been analysed in many countries to understand gender equality progress and its bottlenecks. Thematic analysis of parliamentary debates between 2014 and 2019 that mention the convention indicate concerted efforts by female politicians in both houses of the Oireachtas to maintain pressure on government to ratify the treaty. Core articles of the convention were also used, of course, subsequently by women leaders to argue for the establishment of Quotas. A review of the debates reveal how intransigence about ratification of the convention was framed in terms of its constitutional implications. These often revolved around argumentation that Article 52 on emergency barring orders presented a particular difficulty in relation to property rights under the Irish Constitution. Analysis of resistance to the Istanbul Convention in the European Parliament tells us how parliamentarians can act either as norm promoters or normpreneurs, or norm antipreneurs by framing their support for or in opposition to ratification. Women politicians, in particular those with constitutional legal expertise, were instrumental in challenging that stance that ratification required constitutional reform. Such contests are evident in Oireachtas debates concerning the passing also of the Domestic Violence Bill in 2017. Feminist legal scholars confirmed that work on the bill in that joint committee was essential to broadening the availability of the emergency powering order. An analysis of other key parliamentary committee debates and establishing Quotas more recently indicate how parliamentarians and the key witnesses they invited enacted interest articulation of women's interests that reflect the lived reality of sexual and gender-based violence. Overall, these debates and the associated representational acts accelerated strong impetus within extra-parliamentary contexts for change around DSGBV by using political platforms and voice to maintain visibility of the issue and pressure on the state. While a male minister presided over ratification of the Istanbul Convention, 2 female ministers provided significant stewardship regarding both ratification and the establishment of Quotas. Even so, ministerial leadership cannot on its own advance comprehensive policy development, and it relied on networks of female critical actors in civil society, civil service and the justice system. These women leaders inside and outside of the Parliament acted then as normpreneurs, setting in train a trajectory where gender equality norms drive elements of policy change. This is not to suggest that policy in this area is now comprehensive, adequately resourced and intersectional in all elements, but observers and actors close to the origins of Quotas in particular noted as a break from the past, illustrating policy imagination and co-design. Another aspect of this case illustrates women leaders using symbolic and speech acts on the floor of the Parliament that included rule breaking by a particular female politician, I'm sure known to everyone here, who used a prop in the Parliament in the form of women's underwear aimed at challenging victim blaming in sexual assault cases. That symbolic act and associated speech making that accompanied it, that included reading into the Dáil record the names of murdered women and sharing personal experiences of sexual assault, underlines how women parliamentarians use parliamentary contexts, draw on creative rule breaking to question the norms of representative activity. And given the traditional masculinist culture of parliaments and policy making, these kinds of representative acts were significant in accelerating policy change on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Now, while democratic backsliding is not readily apparent in Ireland, aspects of democratic erosion have been noted. And gender issues are one of the main sites where liberal democratic values are contested. Progressive women's leadership is key, especially as women politicians in far-right policies often work against equality goals. Given men's overrepresentation in politics, male allies are often essential to women's leadership. Nevertheless, women leaders as individual critical actors, as illustrated in the cases here, working together, actively promote gender equality despite their numbers. The cases presented indicate how women leaders, building on long-fought civil society campaigns, acted as amplifiers and accelerants on reproductive rights and on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence to unstick and progress women's rights. In case 1, women leaders embodied and amplified a new way to talk about abortion in Ireland in a parliamentary context that moved beyond polarising debates and progressed the proposed referendum on repeal. In case 2, women leaders in Parliament, civil society and survivors allied with Women's Ministerial Initiative to use parliamentary rules and procedures to push beyond obstacles to ratify international law and policy change on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. The cases reveal the evidence for the role of women leaders as agents of change who work to advance policy in contexts of agents of inertia that have acted as a drag on advancing gender equality policies. These include strategies identified in other contexts of using feminist knowledge, including the experiential and legal expertise, coalition building across parties with women leaders in civil society and in public life, and rulemaking and sometimes rule breaking in parliamentary procedure to deliver progressive policy change. What we know from other contexts is that women leaders are agents of feminist democratic innovation. But this works best when they have high-level political and material support of feminist political leaders. In this sense, progressive women leaders must be buoyed by broader political will and commitment and have access to power to articulate women's interests in responsive and inclusive terms. I'm going to finish up with some recommendations. And these recommendations move us beyond the idea, I think, of adding more women in to unsatisfactory contexts and then placing disproportionate burdens upon them to act for women's interests. And they underline the conditions required for progressive women's leadership. First of all, we need, of course, to create inclusive parliamentary spaces where diverse progressive women leaders are capacitated to lead, by establishing gender quotas and diversity targets at all levels of politics, by enabling women leaders to access power and influence through gender parity commitments, and empowering women politicians to lead under equitable and safe conditions. This also requires exploring the potential of feminist democratic innovations. And secondly, the institutionalization of gender equality machinery and policy processes and practices. This is actually essential to actualizing women's progressive leadership. This can be achieved through dedicated and resourced units in government to advance gender responsive policy making, and by developing systems of co-design and policy making that ensures collaboration with securely resourced and valued feminist civil society organisations in all of their diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pauline. That was very comprehensive and insightful. Just to also say that access to this report will be on the NWC website. And for those of you in the room, we have a few copies that are out there for you to pick on your way out. At this point, I'd like to welcome the panel of experts that will reflect on the reports and challenges facing women's leadership today. So if the panel will please take their seat. This panel will be chaired by journalist, author, and broadcaster Flo McCarthy. She had recently worked on the EU presidency with the Department of Foreign Affairs. Flo will introduce the panelists and will facilitate the discussion. You're very welcome, the panelists and Flo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to say, we're going to chat for about 30 minutes or so, and then at the end you'll have time for your open questions, and especially for those of you joining us online as well. It's just important to let you know you can have your time then. So we are very lucky to be joined by four panelists who've each played a key role in advancing gender equality and progressive society in Ireland. And a brief introduction to each. Beside me here, Janice Sullivan is a former government minister with several portfolios, including education and foreign affairs. She was a member of our parliament and Dáil Éireann for 22 years, previously a senator, councillor and mayor of Limerick. Jan has campaigned on numerous reproductive and women's rights issues. Alva Smith, at the end there, was the first head of women's studies at University College Dublin. She's a long-time passionate feminist and LGBTIQ activist, and has played a prominent role in both marriage equality and Repeal the Eighth referendums. And of course, as we just heard, Repeal the Eighth is one of those in Dr. Pauline Cullen's report. Alva is currently chair of Women's Aid also. Ellen Dunlop is Ireland's representative on the Council of Europe's Graduate Committee, that's monitoring the implementation of the Council's Istanbul Convention, which we were just hearing about. And that, of course, is the second of those cases. Ellen is also adjunct professor of University of Limerick's Law School. She's a former CEO of Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and former chair of our hosts, National Women's Council. Brian Sheehan, in the middle there, is CEO of Women for Election, the national body which encourages and supports women to enter and succeed in politics. He's a former general secretary of a political party, a co-director of the brilliantly successful Yes campaign in the marriage referendum, and former director of Glen, one of the main LGBT advocacy organisations in Ireland, and also co-chair of its European body, Bilgap Europe. And for full disclosure, I just spent the past 2 years working with Brian in Women for Election, doing local, general, national and European elections. And so if you're ever looking for a male expert or ally on equality, these are now. Okay, we've a lot to get through. And if I could turn to you first, Ellen, looking at the question of momentum. So we've been listening to case studies and successes just there. How do you keep momentum going? What can we learn about how to sustain momentum over time on gender equality?
Well, I think information and collaboration are so important. In fact, when Tony was talking there, I was reminded how this didn't happen overnight. There were, when I was in the National Women's Council, I remember there were lots of small groups meeting around the country talking about repeal of the Eighth Amendment. And of course, I think it was fantastic to have Alva, Grania and Orla, who were the leads of the repeal of the Eighth Amendment. And of course, I was thinking of my interest in Irish mythology and the triple goddess. There they were, Alva, Orla and Grania. But I do think, putting aside the personal and committing to working together, that is so important.
How does that work in government, Jan? How can you keep equality on the agenda?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Pauline, for the research. I think it's really, really useful, and to the National Women's Council for organising this. I was reminded when Pauline was talking about rule breaking, etc. I was reminded of my favourite quote, which came from an American working class woman activist, I think probably about 50 years ago or more, which says, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." And I think it's a fantastic quote, and it kind of has driven me along at various times in my life. But yeah, persistence is very important, but being there is very important as well. So I suppose it's a combination of different things. And my own political history, my very first political campaign was 1983, the referendum to push the Eighth Amendment into the Constitution, which I opposed. And one of my last political campaigns was the repeal of the Eighth Amendment. So very nice to get around it. Yeah, but too long. That's why I'm bringing it up, as it took a long, long time to get to that point on that particular issue. And that was to do with Irish society and how slowly it evolved. But there were key moments, and I was just thinking about sometimes the people involved weren't named. One was the 14-year-old girl who wasn't allowed to travel, and that famous cartoon.
Martin Turner's.
Yeah, Martin Turner's kind, that the 14-year-old girl imprisoned in Ireland. So that brought the right to information and the right to travel. And I was thinking about May McGee, who died just a couple of days ago. I never knew her as May.
Under the radar.
Under the radar now, it was an issue around family planning. But she was Mrs. McGee. I only ever knew her name as Mrs. McGee. I never knew her first name. So I think that just shows she was seen as the Mrs. of somebody. And then eventually people began to be named. And I think that made a huge difference in the two referendum, the Eighth Amendment and the marriage equality, where people began to tell stories about real people that real people knew. So those, in a way, when change happened, it happened not very quickly, but it snowballed and it moved in jumps at times because of particular things that happened. But so I think persistence is hugely important, but I also think presence of, I think I've always been a supporter of quotas. I think they have served us well in terms of national elections. I think we need them though for local elections in particular, to bring more women in. And I'm very conscious of the number of young people who are somewhat becoming active, some others becoming disillusioned, and in many cases leaving the country. So I think, you know, we have a new generation now, and I'm part of an older generation that really need to be motivated. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to them, and bringing women in at that level is important. There's an organisation in my constituency, I think they're all over the country, it's Women's Collective. Yeah, and
They're very big, strong and liberal.
yeah, very strong, working mainly in the less advantaged communities, and describe themselves as feminist. Unapologetically, they're feminist organisations.
Should be rolled out in us.
So I think again it is that collaboration, and I think just one other point about presence. I think your point, Pauline, about committees is important as well. There's a lot of that collaborative work happens in committees where people come in and give evidence to the committee. Parliamentarians ask questions, and I think maybe if committee reports had more power than they have. I mean, I've experienced being on a lot of committees where we did great reports, and then they fell into a black hole somewhere. So even if committees' reports could be given some kind of power as the amendment committee,
To keep the conversation
that
going
would keep
as
the
well.
conversation going and actually make.
And I noticed you were nodding there about Meg McGee, or Mrs. McGee, as Jan described her. But you've been involved in numerous successful campaigns. How do you keep that focus going after a big win? Because it's not over then.
Okay, well, first of all, I've also been involved in a lot of very unsuccessful campaigns. So I think you always have to keep a sense of proportion. But I would really like to thank the National Women's Council for commissioning this research, because it's really important for us to have that kind of really excellent research that Pauline has done that backs up our sense of how it is that women function in these institutions, which are so important for us in terms of regulating our lives and the power structures. And I'd also like to thank Maya for mentioning the Our Voice, Our Choice win in the European Parliament this morning, which, as I was coming down the street, I was hopping along thinking, you know, there are bright lights shining. And that's without even talking about President-elect Connolly and the capacity that her campaign had to mobilise young people, which I think actually goes to your point, Jan, which is very important. But I think that, you know, when you're campaigning, you don't start off saying to yourself, I'm in this for the long haul. But if you're going after something really big, that there is a lot of, you know, a lot of uncertainty, reluctance, resistance to within your culture, your society, you have to actually put it into your head that you're going to be going incrementally. You are not going to have the revolution tomorrow. It is going to be a process. Nobody ever told me it would be 35 years from 1983 until whatever it was, 2018. But it was, but that time, I have to say, also passed very quickly. But I think really very, you know, you mentioned to me at the very beginning, Flo, when I came in, you'd be asking about momentum. And I think that my own learning from campaigning over the years is that every good campaign, or whether win or lose, has a post-campaign strategy. And if you don't know what you're going to be doing the day after the campaign, you should stop, go home, sit down and work it out now. Because what you actually need to be doing is building on your strengths, tackling the people and the areas that resisted. You need to be cementing the relationships that you've made, and you basically need a plan of action, which in turn will mobilize your troops again, because people go home after a campaign and they sit there saying, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Which they've done after marriage equality. And in fact, I remember being down in the RDS account after marriage equality. And in my bag, I always have bag with leaflets in it. I was taking out leaflets for joining coalitions. And people were saying, what coalition tree? Well, you know, we're just counting the votes from marriage. I said, yeah, and you know what's next.
Never miss an opportunity.
So, but it's very important to think in terms of what are the connections between campaigns. So that was, you know, thinking about the connections, what other movements and campaigns can we link up with, and what is our strategy, what's our political strategy, what is our awareness and mobilisation strategy.
And
really key point.
Speaking of those connections, Albert, Brian, of course, the broad collaboration and consensus in a campaign like Yes Equality, you know, that's really important to bring people together, that broad coalition. How does it work? How did you make that work?
In the context of that, I think it's picking up what Jan talked about, which is actually creating spaces where people tell their stories. And I think it's that which reshapes how people think about things. Prior to marriage, there was civil partnership, and all across the country, about 2,000 couples had civil partnerships. And all across the country, men and women got married on the front page of their local newspaper, and suddenly it wasn't them up there in Dublin who were, you know, perverting the course of the nation. And the same happened in repeal in the most beautiful way, even though the stories were really hard to hear. And I think that's what does it, but it gets to the core point, which is the absence of women's lived experience in political decisions compounds, as Pauline talks about, the over-representation of men everywhere. And it means that women's lived experience is missing from every single political decision that's ever taken. And I think that's where the problem arises.
So those stories of real life are really important in all of these cases. And you've mentioned them, Maya's mentioned them, so has Pauline. But when you are running a campaign, how do you bring the disparate elements together? Alva mentioned Catherine Connolly's recent presidential election win, for example, but in marriage equality, for example, how did you do it? Because very often in those broad consensus coalitions, the disparate elements will be coming from different strands, different ideas.
Well, on that, I think, and repeal was the same. There's a framework you set up as, you know, there was a great line, Cronny Healy and I were co-directors, and with the great Noel Whelan, and we wrote a one-page document, and at the end of that is, and everything else is not our job. So you set a clear framework for what we're about to do. It's a battle, not a war. And then you enable people to do their best work. There are people, you're right, the recent presidential campaign has shown there are phenomenal people running organizations, running communities, the glue that keeps Ireland together. Our biggest challenge is to bring them into politics. And I think Women's Collective, and I'll finish this, is a really interesting one. It's about the only organization that says not that we will work with our communities to engage with politics, but we will work with our communities to be politicians. And if it's the one thing that Pauline's research has shown in an Irish context, it's lots in international context, is that we need more of those women to start thinking about becoming politicians. Women for Election are here to help, and other organizations. Call us, we want you. You need to be in politics. If you've been in Catherine Connolly's campaign, join politics. If you've been in Heather Humphrey's campaign, join up with politics. You may not run, but women supporting women is the crucial bit that's going to reshape.
And that's your mobile number.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I just wanted to speak about the Istanbul Convention because we have, and I was really pleased, Pauline, to see you, you know, addressing the Istanbul Convention and how important it is to, you mentioned the legal and how important it is to have the legal information, because I remember, and also moments, and I remember a moment where Dr. Susan Leahy from UL, who had done her research on consent, and there was a big resistance to putting a definition of consent into the new legislation, because we were told, oh, we don't need it because we have enough case law, blah, blah, blah. But we did need, and we do need, and we needed, again, a bit more about consent in our legislation. However, but it was that moment where her research was handed to the minister. The minister brought it to Maura Whelan, who actually made it happen. And that was, so you have those moments, you know, where, and that you act, and it's a bit like outside of the norm, if you like. And you have to just be there and push it.
I might just add something to that, because I think that's a really important point. And I, you know, when I think of both of the case studies, one of the aspects that for me really stood out as being very important, I'm not sure to name it quite like this, but that there are these go-betweens the connectors between the activists, the campaigners, civil society, and the politicians. And you know, I'm looking at Chad and other women politicians over many years, both in relation to violence against women and also reproductive rights and so on, who we were constantly building relationships, sustaining those relationships, constantly talking. And that was very, very clear, I think, during the whole Istanbul Convention process. And then again in Repeal, where one of the very interesting things that happened with the Joint Committee that you studied so well, I found that absolutely fascinating, Pauline, was the fact that a lot of us as activists and campaigners were able to sit in on the Joint Committee hearings as observers. And of course, you can't speak at those meetings. However, people come out. So members of the committee come out into the hall, and so do the observers. And that's when you have a lot of exchange, marking of the card, saying, did you think of such and such, and what about so-and-so? So those very personal relationships that you build with people, and particularly those connections between the political and the more activist and campaigning, they are really crucial. I couldn't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, no, I was a member of that committee and I represented the Labour Party on the committee. And it was an extraordinary experience. First of all, we did have those kinds of connections, as you said. I think the legal expertise was really important as well, which Pauline has mentioned. But we had sort of sideline relationships, you know, where a number of us from different political parties who were in that group met with people who helped us, you know, as well. But the dynamic within the committee was quite extraordinary. And the tone, you mentioned again, the tone in the report. Women were very respectful of each other, no matter what they're now. There were a few outliers who were just completely rejecting everything. But I mean, I was very interested in the kind of relationships between, for example, fairly the left-winger women, most left-wing women in some ways, and some of the middle ground of the more conservative parties, and became quite friendly with each other. And I think women in the middle ground of the two big parties actually moved during the course of those connections and dialogue. Because connections were made, and also there were a couple of good leaders in those two parties that were also working with the rest of us who wanted to progress the issue.
On this and women inside the political system, Brian, can I ask you, how can activists and advocates better support women who are in politics to make these changes?
Oh, I'd say run for office, actually, simply. I'll talk a little about the descriptive. Paula's research is more women matter, more feminist women matter, more women with political power and influence matter. But that's just it. It's a universal truth not acknowledged by anyone else except feminists, right? Ever in Ireland, there have been 5,280 people elected to the Dáil, right? 4,903 of them have been men, 377 have been women, right? That's 7%. So, and of that 377, many women were elected sometimes. 151 women ever have been in our parliament. I don't know the men, it's just too many of them. But we still have an absence of, like, those, we're at 25% women in the Dáil at the moment. We're 96th in the world, which is like, people look at you as if to say, what? There are
Government has reduced the number.
no, there is so 14 of our 43 constituencies have no women. So in our local elections, we're at 27%. We're 23rd out of the EU 27 in the number of women in local government. 32 of our 166 local electors have no women representation. That will only change when women, as ever, take up the burdens of running for elected office or helping other women get elected, or maybe, if you're really stuck, helping feminist men get elected in a particular area. But so we've huge challenges as a democracy. Our democracy is in peril, and it will be solved in a way when more women are in power because people feel more represented. And as Pauline has pointed out, the basis of how politics are conducted is different. One positive light, we'll stop with this. Our Shamad has 45% women, and the first traveller women ever elected in Irish politics. Like that's Alan Flynn. And that shows you that we can work it. But the last point, it's voters. A piece of research we did, that the reasons people vote, right? And of 8 reasons, gender was 7 of 8. We have to work together to apprise voters of the power of their vote to reshape our democracy to be more inclusive democracy.
Because in the last 18 months, as we saw, we had more women running for election than ever before in Ireland. It's just the dial didn't move. Just one last one on the numbers though. The fact that the government has reduced the number of women in leadership roles, in cabinet, for example, does that have an impact on all of this? Can it become a rallying call?
The media lambasted the government on it because it was pathetic, actually. You know, you went from 4 women in cabinet to 3 women in cabinet. And they then said, oh, we're going to resolve it when it comes to our junior ministers. They expanded the number of junior ministers and didn't appoint any extra ministers. So we're now 20, and there are 4 women chairs of committees across 23, I think, committees. So there's 2 things about it. One is, and we've always called for 40% as a minimum number of women in positions, as Pauline talks about, power and influence. We have to be slightly careful. There are 25% women in the Oireachtas. We can't burden them with being a junior minister and a committee chair and everything else. They have constituency work. Women get far more constituency work than men anyway. So like there's a balance somewhere, and the answer is more women.
Can I just say, and one of the points that I think Pauline makes repeatedly in the research, in a, where it comes up subtly throughout, is that it's not just women, it is also which women, which women are being elected. And I think, made a very good point about the Women's Collective Ireland, for example, which I happen to be patron of, very proud of that here today. But it is really important for us to actually look at the composition. This also goes for men, of course, that to have a truly representative democracy, that we have to look at. We have to look at that diversity, but also the fact you're never just a man and you're never just a woman. There's always class, there's always ethnicity, there's always disability, age, sexual, all gender, all kinds of things come into it. And that's really, really important in all of the work that we're doing at the moment, particularly as our population demographically is changing so rapidly. So
and we still have people on the margins.
Yes, but it was great to see that built into the work.
Yeah.
One of the Grevio reports on the Istanbul Convention, in the second round, we've been identifying trends. And one of the trends is violence against women, the escalation of violence against women, particularly women in public life and online. So it's not just the regular media, it's social media. And I do think that we need to seriously look at these tech companies, and in terms of we need to put in legislation around the type of abuse that's been used, and particularly women. And women in politics, and actually women journalists themselves as well.
Brian, you've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah, but it's an interesting.
6C, for example, that we identified.
Yeah, Jennifer talked about that. One of the things that was really interesting, so we worked with the Gardaí across the elections to produce a guide for canvassers, our candidates, primarily women ourselves, see her elected in the Gardaí. And one of the things that was interesting is when we launched it, it was about bringing the Gardaí and helping them understand that, a poster being destroyed is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a massive gendered aspect in how posters are destroyed. Right? Anyway, the Daily Mail ran with the headline, Gardaí say women shouldn't canvass. Right? So there is somewhere we have to get the message out that notwithstanding, and in fact endorsing precisely what you say, there's a massive increase in gender-based violence in the public sphere. Most women, most of the time, have respectful interactions on the door, even when people disagree with your politics. That isn't true for women of colour. isn't true for women who identify as trans, and it certainly isn't true in general for many women, I suppose. But that's about how we as the public behave as much as turning off algorithms and everything else, because the tech companies have a monstrous responsibility for the shaping of who we are today. But it's not turning off women, it's turning off people around women who say you would be daft to run. So our job is to try and support women through that. And as Pauline said in our recommendations, you get those recommendations implemented at a serious level and also at a council level.
Well, as somebody who ran
Yes.
and didn't get elected, can I say, I must say I enjoyed the experience, and I didn't get on the doorsteps any negativity. And for me, I think this work that I'm doing now is, for me, was not about politics, but I would encourage women to put themselves forward, because I think it's really important to do that.
Well, even down to someone who ran and was elected.
Yeah, well, actually, the last time I was elected, I mean, I've gone now to the national politics now since 2020. And I think it has got a lot more difficult since then. It definitely has changed. But, you know, I was campaigning recently in the presidential election, and people open their doors, people are polite, almost everybody. You get a very occasional one that isn't.
Yeah.
But there's also, I think, an importance of people who run campaigns to have them protective of people who are knocking on the door.
And of course, those
to make sure that, you know, there is that sort of, and that, you know,
social media is completely out of control.
Yeah.
And that is sometimes, you know, provoked and agitated by commentators, as we saw in the presidential election, where very unprecedented and inappropriate language was used by a particular commentator in relation to a woman candidate. And that kind of thing.
Not the first time we've seen that.
Not for the first time, but it needs to be scrapped. It is completely unacceptable, because that does put women on in particular, and particularly young women who are so understanding and so knowledgeable about social media. I mean, I don't know at all. I can say, well, it wouldn't affect me. That's because I'm not a native user.
Yeah.
But for those
You're great on
who are,
Insta, though.
it's very different. Sorry?
You're great on Insta.
Great.
I like your Instagram.
Oh, do you look at all on? My point is that that's a really important channel of communication for young people, and particularly for young women. And for that to be such a brutal area, that is something which we absolutely have to get a grip on, because that's about fundamental safety and security.
Yes, it is. And on the bigger question on that, we're seeing the backlash, of course, everywhere to gender equality in politics. Roe v. Wade, fewer women than ever before, MEPs. How do we talk about gender equality with that growing resistance, even to DEI, for example?
Well, I think we need, first of all, Pauline says that she doesn't think there's backsliding in our democracy. No, but it is stuck. It is stuck. It's not moving forward. So we need to talk about that, because when there is stuckness in the political system, that always sticks. There's always misogyny there somewhere. There's always transgender, you know, homo and lesbophobia. There's always racism. All of those things are swimming around there. So it's really important for us to be going out there and saying we want a truly representative democracy, and we want to see it on the move. We do not want to see it stuck. And I think that came across very, very clearly in the, not so much the televised debates or the radio debates in the presidential election, but in a lot of the conversations and discussions that were happening on the good part of social media, if I could put it that way, and also in kitchens and in bars and the places where conversations are held. So we have to keep that. And of course, you know, I'm very conscious as, you know, as a card-carrying feminist for something like, I don't know, 50 years or whatever it is, that you can never take that card out of your hand.
Yeah.
You have to hold it up high the entire time, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the world. And you have to keep carrying it on. People say to you, you're not fed up No, absolutely not, because we have not made the progress that we need to make, and that's what Women for Election is about.
John, what can political leaders do to, respond when gender becomes a polarizing issue?
Well, first of all, I think we do have to call out abuse, whether it's online or anywhere else, we have to be willing to stand up and say, this is not acceptable, no matter who it's being done to. But I think, one of the things I was thinking about when Alva was saying about she was planning her next campaign just to counter the previous one. We'd want a general election now for whatever number of years, but I think manifestos and programs for government are really important. I know it sounds, I suppose, political in people. But, the reason why certain things got on the political agenda was because they were put into manifestos and they were put into programs for government, and then they became something that had to be acted upon, and then that allowed for all the collaboration that happened. So I suppose at this point in time, to get that momentum to make things happen, I think we need those conversations between people who are in the political party or independent or whatever they are, and political activists, general organisations like National Women's Council, to start beginning to say, well, what do we want in the next phase of government, whoever is in government in whatever number of years' time, and to start getting the people who maybe were going to run for election in that next election to think about, putting stuff into their own parties' manifestos or, policies or whatever, to ensure that that we don't just slip back into, reaction and populism and whatever.
Can I bring Ellen on, an international framework to help in countering this resistance?
Well, I think it's terribly important, and we know, I know it's said there isn't a backslide, across Europe there's a backslide, and we really need to ensure that we keep democracy, to the fore for us. And after all, equality between men and women, is a key element to the prevention of violence against women. And the Istanbul Convention is so important, and we see positive consequences of it in terms of the policies that we have developed here, and the fact that we have COOM, an all of government, an agency that's going to collaborate and bring all the agencies together. I mean, that's terribly important.
Yes.
And we keep that focus.
You need to bring the audience in, but I just want a quick fire question to throw to you, Brian. We keep talking about the critical mass, say 40% of women in politics. And do you think if we did get that, would that move the dial on gender equality in general?
One of the interesting things about your research, Pauline, is that, and I'm sure it's true at a European level, more women in and of themselves matter, partly because the narrative, the discussions are changed, even if you might not call them feminist women, So, yes, it will change if we reached 40% women. I think it's the kind of stuff you talk about, Jan, that makes sure that change is on the direction in a quantitative leap way towards equality.
And the type of diversity that Alan was talking about as well. Okay, it is time to bring in, as you said, Jan, conversations matter. To any questions, just raise your hand. And if you wouldn't mind maybe saying if you belong to a particular organisation. Sorry.
Lorna McCormack, I'm a European Climate Pact ambassador, but I also ran in the presidential election as an independent. I'm just wondering in relation to women in politics, something that I found while I was campaigning was that people wanted to sanitize my values as a woman, sanitize my views on certain areas that I work in personally. How do you navigate that as a politician or as anybody in politics?
Sanitize, what is it?
Yes.
Did you say sanitize? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, first of all, you refuse to be sanitized. The simple answer, but you respect the person who's saying whatever they're saying to you, and you have an engaged conversation with them. But don't back down on your own view, I suppose. But genuinely engaged.
Party.
No, you have to do it in a party. I think. I mean, if you're in a party, obviously there are going to be different variations of views, and that's, you know, that's political debate within parties and outside of parties. So I think you have to have respectful conversations, but you know.
Can I just say from the perspective of, say, the concept of rape, which I remember for a long time in Ireland, what you could speak about it, but to, you know, I remember the Rape Crisis Centre running fundraising events, and it couldn't be called the Rape Crisis Centre fundraising event, it had to be called the Climate, you know, the music group, they lent their name to it. But now, thanks to amazing victims, survivors of sexual violence who waive the right to anonymity, and they come out and speak, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. So, you know, these are people who have been violated, and they are the ones, they're not sanitizing it, they're standing up and saying it. So they are, I think, great role models for us. So
keep going, Lorna.
keep going.
With questions online also? Yeah, Lily.
Hi there. We had great engagement online, very praising to the panelists. So we have a comment from someone in Northern Ireland. Currently in Northern Ireland, we have positive female representation at the highest levels of government, and broadly positive female representation in leadership in our political parties and in some key judicial positions. But change seems as elusive as ever in terms of gender equality. Just wondering if there is any comment on the visibility of women with little change happening?
So with visibility of women in leadership, will change finally start to happen?
Well, it certainly helps, obviously. But I think you do need that critical mass. And I think that there is still an enormous amount of work which reporting points to in research, and particularly when you look at the recommendations of the need for political parties and for government to take on a centralizing, a centering really of the importance of gender equality in terms both of the numbers of a balance between the numbers of women and men. Personally, I think 50-50 is better than 40-60, but they go.
Or 60-40.
40 or 70-30 would be ideal. That's another day's work. But I think it's also about policies, it's also about practices, it is also about actually political parties, led by women or not, actually getting behind gender equality and providing the kind of support structures, and I include funding in that,
Yes,
to
as
support
Maya
women
mentioned.
candidates,
Yeah.
which is so important.
Yeah.
And political parties, okay, we're not backsliding, but political parties in this country, and I have not been confabulating with Brian, but my understanding is that they're not putting the money behind the women. They're not putting the money into those gender equality policies and anything like the kind of, to the extent that is necessary to do that. So we do actually have a job of work to do there, to say, look, you've got to invest in women.
Yeah.
If you are really genuine about achieving equality.
Come to you 1 second.
Yeah.
Alva didn't actually pose that question to you, Brian, but I will. So
Well,
what can political parties?
What she said is all I'd say. I'm always mindful, Pierre Trudeau, when he became Prime Minister of Canada in 2016, he said he was going to appoint a gender equal cabinet. And when the cabinet was announced in early 2017, he did. And he was asked at his first press conference, why on earth have you given women 50% position? And he just said, because it's 2017. He never answered another question, but again, that's the kind of political leadership we need. We have 3 opposition parties run by women. We have a woman president. The bounces that happened from other women presidents were limited, and there was a leap, but it stayed static. And I think Alva's right. We need political. Some parties are very good at it.
Yes.
Better be fair. But the parties, particularly those that are long established, have greater challenges because, you know, it's the ground level up. But actually that changes, and you probably can attest that better, when more women get involved at every level of politics.
including committees.
Everything. I'm always reminded of that.
Internally.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the point that comes up is about more women creating, I love this phrase, a cordon sanitaire, so that the women are there and they're preventing some of the horrible things being said. They're also encouraging the good action. So as you get more women in, it rises to the top. But political parties have to look at their policies. So that directly answering the question in relation to the norm,
Yeah.
I think is really very important. And there is a recommendation there that there be a government unit, I think, for gender equality. So, you know, something in the Taoiseach's office, like they have all of this colossal money going into the shared island thing, why not put even a fraction of that colossal money into the gender equality thing? And let's see how that would work. And that would be a real challenge for some, you know, really progressive, go ahead, feminist or even semi-feminist party leader to actually take on. I would encourage them to do that.
Great answers and suggestions to a really good question. Thanks. We've got another one in the room here.
Hi, I'm actually a third year politics and international relations student in UCD, and I was wondering what advice would you give to young women who are looking to run for election in the near future?
Jan, third year politics student at UCD.
Well,
Advice.
I suppose, first of all, get out there and campaign for whatever campaign you feel passionate about. I'm not sure if there's anything specific coming up, is there, in the near future? So I'm always talking about whatever. But yeah, but I mean, if you want to get involved in a political party,
Yeah.
suss them out, you know, see which one is best suited to you. I don't know if you're involved in student politics, but that's an awful lot of people who come into the Dáil have started out in student politics, and gives you a real opportunity to fight your corner in various you know, situations. I remember chairing last year, the year before, in the University of Limerick, chairing the hustings for the student body elections, and it was a great experience, like just listening to people in your situation, you know, putting themselves forward for whatever the positions were. So I'd say get going on something immediately, but look at what political parties are offering as well. And maybe you won't find anything, you might be an independent, like whatever. But and you know, get involved in anything that is political that you're interested in. Basically, I would say just don't wait for something to happen.
And just, thanks, John, just to add, the Women for Election website has fantastic resources as well.
Yes, and there are 3 questions, maybe we can take the 3 questions just to.
Okay, and then we've got 3 more in the room. Always happens that we're running out of time. We
Hi.
keep our answers succinct.
Hi there. Is it me or the online? Yeah, me for now.
Yes,
Yeah.
you.
Okay, thanks. Just to say thanks to all the panelists. My name is Billy Sparks. I'm the General Secretary of the Labour Party. So Alva, to your point, I'll just be clarified that the Labour Party does invest in our women. But my question is, and Brian, you touched on it there, the recent presidential election. You're right. Historically, there's very little uplift from a woman getting elected to presidential office. But I think what was noticeable about this campaign was obviously the collaboration amongst parties on the left, many of which are led by women. We have Ivana Bacik in the Labour Party, Mary Lou McDonald leading Sinn Féin, and then Holly Kearns obviously leading the Social Democrats. And I'm just wondering, and I know in addition to that, a lot of the senior staff positions in those parties are held by women. So I'm just wondering if the panel would have any particular views on that and feel if that maybe contributed to the level of collaboration behind that particular campaign.
You know, Billy, I was really thinking about the 2 parties in power at the moment who are not actually investing in women, and not the parties that you quite rightly mentioned there. I actually think that, you know, that moves towards a more unified left, for example, in any coming general election, which could be sooner than we think, if government can collapse at any moment. Not just the possibility, but I think that it helps, because I mean, I think it's also fair to say that you find much more progressive thinking on gender equality, on women, on, you know, on all kinds of important issues. The more you move towards the left from from the right towards the left. Of course you do. So it's really in all our interest to encourage that. That's not to let the right off the hook, but it is important for us to encourage that. And one of the hopes that I would have emerging from, I mean, certainly presidential election, but other things as well, is that we would, and that we will, have some form of unity, solidarity in a coming general election. And I mean, there's a by-election going to be coming up. It'll be interesting to see how that plans out. I hope that women will be running in the West Galway constituency. And, you know, all of that, I think, is actually looking quite positive for us.
That's going to be
one of the
hardest.
things, my final point is that one of the things that really, really sticks out, it's something that we knew, but it's great to see it in the research. Women are more cooperative, we are more collaborative, we are more likely to talk to one another, we are more likely to make deals with one another. Nobody likes to use the word compromise in politics, but that's actually what it's always about. And we are actually more likely to be willing to think about making compromises. You can call them maybe flexible arrangements or adaptations. You don't have to use the word compromise, but we're much more open to that because we're so used to, not by some kind of essential biological equality or pros though, but we're used to having to negotiate and to work our way around things and to find ways around. So I think that is all very much something to be fought for because it's in our
That's a good question, Billy. We've got another maybe at the
Thank you. My name is Anya Kennedy. I currently work as a parliamentary assistant in the Shannon. But before that, like I've been an activist for a very long time. Brian knows the marriage. I was the convener for marriage equality, for repeal, and for the Catherine Conley campaign in Carlow-Kilkenny. And I've been involved in loads of other things. So even just from that political activism space, I've been very lucky that my children are that bit older because I always found that women of my age growing up through all of those campaigns couldn't get involved because they had young children. And that excludes women from canvassing because it's at times in the evening where you can't go canvassing because you've got kids to put to bed and that sort of stuff. And you may not have that family structure around. And what I'm also seeing now, only that my children are adults, could I do the job I'm doing now? I could not do the job I'm doing now, never mind the politicians, because I travel up from Kilkenny on a Tuesday morning and I don't go back until Thursday night. And that excludes so many women from actually participating in politics and in the political structure needs to change. Yeah.
good response.
So two things. It's disgraceful that the voting block tonight in the Dáil is 20 past midnight. I think that's outrageous. One other thing. It is interesting that some of the men who stepped down the last time said they're doing it because they want to see their children. Suddenly, the issue of childcare may now appear on the political agenda. It does. The third thing, of course, you're right, and yet it's ridiculous. There are other models. There's loads of reports there. The gender report from Parliament, the family friendly report, the National Women's Council, family friendly local authorities. Like it's outrageous that the men who overrepresent themselves in politics, I say the irony here, actually can reshape politics to be more family friendly and to recognise caring arrangements. It's not a big deal. Why couldn't we have 3 weeks of the Dáil, Monday to Thursday, and 1 week off, for example? There's lots of ways you could do that. Not off. I mean, who could do constituent stuff, be at home. I mean, anyway, look.
I mean, we could change to when we had the pandemic so much, you know, we could do like immediately. And legislation could be passed like that as well, so.
And ministers can now take maternity leave, which.
Can I come back to the, I suppose, Istanbul Convention? I just want to really emphasize how important the funding, you mentioned the funding, how important it is to ensure that the funding stays with the women and the feminist organizations, because these are the things that we're seeing are being cut back in Europe, right across Europe, because yes, there is a huge, threat with Putin, particularly along the Baltic countries. But if we don't invest in women's organisations, you know, it's hopeless.
Very good note. I'm going to be fired up two really speedy ones, and man at the centre here.
Thank you. Great, Mahagot. My name is Luke Conlon. I'm a full-time student studying for a master's in spirituality. I just want to echo the comment online there. My experience is coming from living in Wales for over 30 years, and there we have a parliament, a Senate there, where it's 48% female and 52% male in the Senate, which is great. There's some really fine working class women in the Welsh Assembly, or the Senate as it's called now. It's not reflected in local authority, but we still have the problem that in the community level, it's probably the same in Ireland, it's women who are holding the community up. And in between, my background is in men's development work with men's groups, and really it just comes back to what, forgive me, Alva, do beg your pardon. That stuckness you mentioned, that stuckness is us men not willing to own up to our entitlement and our entitlement we're born with, and that's the stuckness really. And similarly in Wales, we're trying to work hard in communities to get us men to stand up and own that entitlement and begin to share it really. So that's really what I have to say.
Other jurisdictions, what we can learn from Wales, from Finland, from New Zealand, etc. And a very quick final question here. I'm sorry I didn't give you a chance to respond there to.
Hi, I'm Sinead McMahon from the National Traveller Women's Forum, and I know that Jennifer opened this discussion by talking about intersectionality, and it's come up again as a theme, especially when Alva said which women are elected. And unfortunately, Traveller women are still very much underrepresented at all levels of politics in Ireland. And when we're talking about substantive representation, it's very important to remember the importance of that for Traveller women and ethnic minority women in Ireland. And although we have Senator Eileen Flynn, she's the only Traveller representative. And in some ways, we've seen how there are challenges in terms of providing that substantive representation when you face barriers within the Parliament. And I think the role of gendered institutions is particularly significant there. And we saw how Senator Flynn had to step down from her role as chairperson of the Oireachtas Committee on Key Issues Affecting the Traveller Community.
And I'm going to take that as a final comment here, rather than a question. But as you can see, this consensus and not. Well, very much for your time and to all of the panelists, especially, and those of you online.
So thank you very much. On behalf of NWC, I'd like to sincerely thank everyone who has joined us this morning, both in person and online. Your engagement has contributed to the success of this event. I would like to again appreciate our thanks to the Irish Architectural Archives, European Women's Lobby, who is represented here today. I'd like to say a big thank you to the panel of the chair, Flo McCarthy, and the distinguished panelists, Alva Smith, Ellen O'Malley Dunlop, Jan O'Sullivan, and Brian Sheehan for your insightful contribution and reflection. Again, a note of thanks to and appreciation to Professor Pauline, the author of the significant research and the reports, for her rigorous scholarship and commitment to advancing the understanding of women's leadership and representation. Finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to Liliana Fernandez and the National University. Thank you all once again for your support and your participation. I wish you all the very best and a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Also,